There we go. All right, yeah, starting. So yeah, hi everybody. Welcome to this talk with Meryl Breidbart. Meryl is a co-founder of Chirps, which is an insect protein company, and an investor at One Ventures. And we're going to talk today about eating insects and alternative proteins in general, and Meryl's experience as a climate tech investor. Yeah, I'm personally really excited to host Meryl, and looking forward to learning about insect proteins today. Yeah, basically from what I learned, the traditional animal protein industry is just mind-blowingly inefficient and polluting, even more than we think. And I'm looking forward to hearing like just how much better insects are in this respect. And I also have, I guess, something bordering a sense of awe at the investment firm that Meryl is at. So I'm looking forward to learning more about that too. A little bit about how this event will go. So it'll be pretty informal. Meryl will talk about her work, then we'll ask questions, and people have submitted some questions in advance, so I'll give priority to those. Yeah, also this event is hosted by Work on Climate. It's possible that some of us here are from outside the community because generally our events are open to all. If anyone here is from outside Work on Climate, we are a Slack community that helps people pivot their careers into climate through a variety of programs. Come join us at workonclimate.org. I'm Eugene. I'm a co-founder of Work on Climate. I'm facilitating this. Another reminder that this event is recorded, and we will be posting a recording and notes to the event's official channel. Almost all of our events are recorded, so you can also find recordings of past events. And one more thing, we will also be taking notes in the document that I just pasted a link into the chat. So if people can help collaboratively take notes, that's really helpful, especially helpful for people who are going to be looking at this in the future. Like people don't always have the patience to watch a video, so notes are much easier in this sense for scanning. So more people will know what happened here if we take good notes. So yeah, that's pretty much it. With that, on to Meryl. Yeah, what's your story, Meryl?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat, and totally fine if everyone wants to keep their video off, but if you want to turn your video on, you're more than welcome to join us as well. But yeah, I'm like, as was said, I'm excited to keep this pretty casual and conversational, but it can give a little bit of color to that bio about my background, and then really happy to chat about anything that is of interest. So I sort of started my career in an interesting place where right after college, I was beginning an MFA program in design for social innovation, which is sort of studying lots of different types of design thinking, all the way through sort of prototyping with the specific lens of social impact. And at the same time, founded this crazy business with two friends from college called Chirps, where we make tortilla chips and protein powder and a couple other SKUs of products using crickets as a protein source. And I wish I could say that this was born out of sort of a lifelong passion that I've had for eating insects, but the truth is that in the summer of 2013, which was right after we graduated from college, the United Nations came out with a report that, knowing this crowd is probably familiar to most, if not all of us, sort of analyzing and predicting what the world was going to look like as our population grew and our protein demand grew with it. And one of the suggestions that the report made was that, given how factory farming and the livestock industry operated at the time, which is largely how it operates today, we were going to need to shift the way we consumed protein in order to be more sustainable, to actually have a planet to live on. It's like front of mind for a lot of people now, but at the time was sort of still in a phase where I think there were a lot of climate deniers, and climate change was low on the list of priorities of people were having at the time. So weirdly enough, my co-founders and I had each actually eaten insects at different points in our lives. My 10th grade chemistry teacher brought in a product that were mealworms, sort of flavored like Cheetos, and to class one day and to see who was willing to eat them. One of my co-founders had studied abroad in Africa and had insects while she was there. My other co-founder is originally from China, which eats insects frequently. And so we sort of read this report and heard about this idea. And with the sort of confidence that one has as a recent college graduate, I would say. We thought, well, we could do that. Like, that doesn't seem like it's going to be the craziest of ideas to start a business introducing insects into the, United States market, United States palate. And so that is precisely what we did. And we started with the product that we're most well known for, which is Chirps. And from there sort of expanded. And I can certainly dive more into that with questions, but one of the key things that we learned along the way is that, and questions that have come in advance or sort of around this as well, is the market was really not there in 2013 for insect protein. When I say this to people, and it still sort of blows my mind that this is how this went, but I would say to people, yeah, we're making snacks using crickets. And people would say, like, the sport, because it was so foreign to people at the time that what I meant was the insect and that we would be eating the insect, that like their first thought was to go to this totally illogical thing of us eating a sport, which I still don't really understand, but I think really well highlights where we were in the world at the time. Because I think today everybody is familiar with the concept, at least, of eating insects, if not, they've been offered an insect to eat before. So at the time, the market really was not there. And when we tried to we raised some money through angel investors, and we actually were on Shark Tank a couple years into the business. But when we tried to raise true venture capital dollars, we struggled, which is a familiar thing. CPG is pretty hard to raise venture capital money on in general, but certainly not possible when the market is not going to grow exponentially year over year. And so that sort of sparked an interest for me in the VC space. And I went from there. So I've worked on Chirps like since the beginning in a part-time capacity, because we weren't able to raise the money that we needed to have all of us full time. I'm trained as a designer, so a lot of my work was also possible to do sort of nights and weekends. And when you're, in your early 20s, you can work a lot. And so I worked at two other tech startups in New York that were VC backed, and got a taste of what that world is like a little bit, and decided I wanted to, continue to work on Chirps the whole time. I was really intrigued by venture capital and saw an opportunity in this space to create a lot of positive change for people's lives, both the businesses that people were creating and the impacts that those were going to have on society, but also the individuals. So I went to business school, and after graduating, joined a fund that was focused solely on computer vision and investing in the very earliest stages, but recently left about 3 months ago to join this new fund called At One Ventures, which is a pretty new fund founded in February 2020. We're a fund that focuses on seed and Series A investments, and we only invest in climate tech. So the way we talk about it, the way you'll sort of read about it on our website, is we invest in people building businesses to help humanity be a net positive to nature. So sort of spans across a ton of industries and ecosystems, and just anything that's helping reduce our footprint on the planet, and that can grow it to be a big business. So that's like a little bit of a landscape or overview of what I've done in my career, but maybe I'll pause and see if there are any. I know we had some questions submitted in advance, so we can start there, or if anyone has any burning questions top of mind now. But yeah, hopefully that's a good enough overview to start.
Yeah, Meryl, can you tell a little more about like where Chirps is today? Like how are you guys doing? And I guess another burning question is like, what does it taste like?
Sure. Yeah, I wish I could have virtually sent everybody some. Yeah, so the business today still exists. I would say that COVID was challenging for us, like it was for many businesses, especially because a lot of our distribution was at museums and zoos and sort of spaces that were affected by the pandemic. But we have a pretty healthy online business, both like through our website and through Amazon. And we have some retail locations as well. So we've been doing well. I would say that we are thinking about making a push towards pushing our protein powder product a little bit more, because I think it's a product that speaks well to consumers who are, working from home and things like that, versus a chip product, which might do well when you're out and about, things like that. But the business still exists and we run it. There's 4 of us who work on the business sort of in bits and pieces. And what does it taste like? So to be honest, so crickets we use crickets. There's lots of different insects that one can use, and we can talk more about that. But we've used crickets from the beginning, and crickets, when they're dry roasted and milled into a powder when we get them in our facility. And that sort of, it looks a little bit like brown sugar or light brown sugar. And it's just added as an ingredient to when we make tortillas. And then the tortillas are, cut and fried and made into chips and seasoned. So if I didn't tell you that crickets were in our product, you probably wouldn't know, because the taste and flavor is pretty, I like to say it tastes a little nutty, but it's not an overpowering flavor like cinnamon, where if you put a dash of cinnamon in anything, like, cinnamon is in it, you could probably not taste anything else. Cricket is not like that. So it works really well in smoothies. It works really well in baked goods. If you follow our Instagram account, we post a lot of different products that have been baked, both with our cricket protein powder as well as just straight up cricket powder, because it just blends really nicely with different flavors. Excuse me.
Mm-hmm. And I guess a related question that somebody has submitted in advance related to, like, what does the business look like is, what does the supply chain for this look like? Like, where do you get the crickets? Like, what was it like before? What's it like now and in the future?
Yeah, so it definitely has changed. When we first started this business, I could only get crickets from pet supply shops, and they came live. So I distinctly remember getting a box. Yeah. I distinctly remember getting a box delivered to my apartment. I was living in Manhattan at the time, and I had a doorman at my building, and a box arrived. And when I went down to pick it up, they said, please don't ever order this again. I don't want to sit here all day with a box that has air holes and says contains live insects. Unfortunately, the supply chain has evolved from there, because it's actually quite difficult to make sure that they all stay in the bowl, and that you then have to kill them yourselves. And it's not a pleasant experience. But at the time, that's really where the market was. The market was around pet feed. It's seriously evolved from there. Wow, that's mm-hmm. quite to have a hissing cockroach delivered. Yeah, that sounds similar. So nowadays we actually supply our crickets from a farm in Thailand, but there are tons of cricket farms and insect farms all over the world that have sprung up in the past, 8 years or so, that are many are specifically for human consumption, and others are for sort of animal feed. Fish feed is a really popular one, or pet feed. And they all have a different sort of supply chain, where the product that you're buying is the powder, as I described before, sort of like milled and dry roasted and milled into a fine powder that you can then just immediately introduce into your assembly line, or into an ingredient list. And so it's definitely evolved over the past couple of years. And when we first started the business, there were no FDA regulations around eating insects or putting them in foods for human consumption. There were no microbial testing standards. So we had to help a group of us who started businesses at that time. Were helping to sort of lobby the FDA and local health departments to establish these regulations that are now just like widely adopted as standard in the industry.
Very interesting. And then, like, when you get them, like, what do you do with them? Do you have your own factory where you make them, or like, are you asking some other factory to make chips from this powder that you ship to them? How does it work?
Yeah, so this is perhaps the most difficult part about starting our business. So most startups in the food space don't like running and setting up your own facility is extremely expensive, and you don't often need to you're not running product every day, right? We're not making potato chips. We're not like Frito-Lay. It's not going to be that scale. So most use what's called a co-packing facility, which is somebody else's business where they have, and we use one that's specific for tortilla chips for our chips and for protein powder for our powder. It is a business where somebody owns a factory that produces tortilla chips and other small businesses pay them to use their recipe and produce the product. So they take it from sort of separate ingredients, and then the final product is like the chips in a bag that you can then, they can either send directly, be picked up by a distributor, or it can go to your warehouse for shipment or fulfillment or whatever is necessary. And so when we were first starting, it was very difficult for us to find a co-packing facility that was willing to introduce crickets into their line, because that sort of changes what all your other products have to then label their products as. So if you've ever eaten, I think it's like a Hershey bar, will often have a label on it that says may contain traces of tree nuts, things like that. The trace amounts are because something else that has been run on that line included that ingredient. And even though they clean everything in between, they just, legally have to warn you about things like that. So we truly opened up the phone book and called hundreds of facilities to see, and really kudos to my co-founders, who the two of them did most of this piece of the project or the business in these early days. We finally found somebody who was willing to work with us. We're actually on our third co-packing facility now, and we're produced out in California. But it took a while, especially because people didn't understand the industry at the time. So that's kind of how it goes. And then there's a question I love that's in the chat, so I might hop over there and answer it as well, which is, why did we choose to start with chips versus anything else? And I get asked this question a lot, and I think we have a pretty good, I'm curious what you guys think, but at the time that we started the business, there were not that many businesses out there using insects. So there was a company that has been around for a very long time called Potlicks, which if you've ever been to a natural history museum as a child or an adult, you've probably seen in the gift shop. It's these very brightly colored lollipops that have a whole insect in the inside. They're sort of a novelty business. They actually are extremely successful business. And so they were one of the biggest businesses at the time. And then a couple people had started protein bar companies. So Chapool was one, which still exists. And then Exo was another. We decided that, we weren't going to start a third protein bar company, because that just seemed like we didn't need yet another in the cricket space. But we thought about what was going to be a business or a product that was going to attract the most people. Because we knew that once you introduced crickets to the ingredient list, the number of people who were going to be willing to try the product, certainly back in 2013, 2014, was going to shrink pretty immediately. So we wanted to start kind of like with the biggest top of funnel, if you will, but also a product that everybody ate. And chips, I don't know anybody who doesn't eat chips. They're delicious, they're crunchy, they fit with lots of different settings. So for us, that was the product that we decided to go with, and it was very difficult. It's a very difficult product to produce because you need, as I said before, you need to use a facility that has the correct equipment. Whereas protein bars, you can actually kind of make in your own kitchen and test that out first. So it ended up being quite a difficult path to go down, but I still think it was the right move for us.
Got it. And Sam is also asking another question. Sam, do you want to maybe unmute yourself and ask live? Sam?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Meryl. Thanks so much for this. I was just kind of curious as to your original journey in looking for VC funding, and when you were kind of struggling to find that funding, would the VCs actually give you reasons that they didn't want to invest? And if so, what were those reasons?
Sure. That's a great question. Yeah, so we definitely got feedback, and the biggest feedback was that the market wasn't ready. And I don't think that they were wrong. But the concern at the time, and this was around, I'd say we probably started seriously looking for funding in 2016, 2017, and 2018, or like the times that we talked to investors. And investors, VC investors specifically, are sort of constrained by the length of the fund. So a fund, when you raise a fund for venture capital, you're taking money from your own investors and promising that in 10 years, you'll give them a return on their investment. Hopefully it's 3x what they put in, which means the investments that you make have to have some sort of exit, whether it's an IPO or an acquisition, within that timeline. And in the early days of our business, the investors that we spoke to weren't seeing the signs that this market was going to grow enough such that 7 to 10 years from that moment, we would have a big enough business to return the initial investment at, it has to be greater than 3x, so that when the losers in the fund are accounted for, that overall you're giving about 3x to your investors. So that was a big learning for us. And it was like the first moment when I realized that there's a specific type of business that works well for venture capital, and it's not every business, and that's okay. And I think it was a really good lesson for us to learn that we weren't well suited for venture capital investment, because you can then end up having to make decisions about your business to grow it exponentially and have certain revenue numbers that might not be what you want for your business, and B, might make it difficult to be profitable. So you can see there's like a ton of businesses now that are IPOing or SPACing or all the different things that they're certainly not profitable. Some of them don't even have revenue yet, because there's this push that you get to fit that timeline and get that return to your investor. So, but that was like, again, another reason why I was intrigued by the industry and wanted to ultimately switch to the other side of the table.
Got it. Thanks. I see other questions popping up. I just wanted to do a quick follow-up maybe. Sure. Because you said that kind of pushed you into the VC space. And so I'm wondering, are you now trying to do something different to be able to include that type of business like yours? Or is there anything that can be done for that?
Yeah, so my fund, the fund I work for now, is also on a 10-year time horizon, which doesn't mean that there aren't other things that we can do. But we, in terms of investing our own money, are sort of tied to that rule as well. But something that we do, that my boss actually does a lot of, is we will connect businesses to grant money and investment dollars that can come in sort of in a different vehicle, so that you aren't tied to the same time horizon. So that maybe in a couple of years, you can then get on the flywheel of VC dollars when you've hit certain milestones or accomplished certain, metrics. So that's one thing. And then another thing that funds will do is, not every fund has to be on that time horizon. Most are about 10 years, but some are 15, some are 20. There are funds that are sort of evergreen funds, which allow for any number of length. I think it's Climate Energy Trust. I was just speaking to them yesterday. They're in Chicago. That's totally not what they're called, though. Let me just look.
Clean Energy Trust?
Clean Energy Trust. Yes, thank you. They are a nonprofit, and so they don't have the time horizon that most funds have, because donors have given them their money without the expectation of getting it back, and they sort of recycle the earnings back into the fund and continue to make other investments. So the industry has changed a lot from when we were looking for investment until now. But it's something I think to think about if you're considering raising money for your own venture. There are lots of different ways to get money, and VC might not be the best way, and there's nothing wrong with that either.
Sense. Yeah, and another question submitted in advance related to this, I guess. What is the 5 to 10 year outlook for alternative proteins in the US? That you think?
Yeah, great question. So alternative proteins in general, I think it's pretty obvious that we're seeing a huge push in that direction. And I think there are some that are very widely accepted by the public. So obviously the plant-based ones are very widely accepted. And I suspect that we will see a similar acceptance of cell-based or lab-grown meat as regulation takes place around it. But I suspect that probably the question was also around insects in general. And I think, as much as it pains me to say this, I think maybe on the 10-year horizon, closer to the 10-year horizon, insects will be more widely accepted as for human consumption. But I think it's going to take something closer to a paradigm shift to get us there. And that might be related to cost. So right now, insects are still pretty expensive. And if we can bring the cost down, people are very price sensitive when it comes to food. I think like the three factors that people consider most when thinking about a food choice are price, proximity, and taste, and probably in that order. And then but on the sort of animal feed or pet feed side, we've actually seen the market grow a lot in the last couple of years. So there's a company called Chippin that's dog food using crickets. But I see on the investing side, I see tons of companies using black soldier fly and things of that nature for fish feed, et cetera, because there's, right now fish feed is largely using fish, and we farm fish to then feed to other fish, and it's destroying, it's killing all the fish in our oceans. It's a big problem. So I think that's like more in the 5 to 7 year time horizon for those businesses to really be mainstream and widespread, as widespread as a business like that could be.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And you mentioned the black soldier fly insect. This is something that Jyoti, it seems, also wanted to ask. Jyoti, do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah, I'm super new to this space, but I was just wondering, initially, how did you pick cricket protein versus, any other insects? Was that the only food grade one at the time? Just curious about that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So at the time, they were the most widely farmed insects, and so they were the most readily available. So that was one factor. I'm not as well versed on sort of the protein content in black soldier fly, but I can also say that for us, crickets were very appealing because, we had considered waxworms and mealworms and other things of that nature, but crickets are very high in protein and low in fat, and the sustainability metrics are incredible. I think that black soldier fry is probably comparable at this point, but it was not something that was widely available at the time. And so when we're thinking just about early days of supply chain, cricket seemed a lot easier. I think the one that's interesting to me that never really took off in the same way, but should have, is grasshopper. So there's some companies in Israel that do grasshopper farming, but I haven't really seen that pick up speed in the same way, which has always been interesting to me.
Well, by the way, you spoke about sustainability metrics. I think, it's worth touching on this point. Could you maybe elaborate, just how much better it is than beef? I heard some pretty staggering numbers, half of habitable land is agriculture, half of that is animals, half of the rest is food for animals. And how is that true? And how does it compare to making similar amount of calories from insects?
Yeah, so I'm gonna shamelessly plug, we have a whole section on our website that's just for this, so I'll share that at that link in the chat for anyone who wants to read it. But basically, the crickets beat cows on most every metric. So they produce 100 times fewer greenhouse gas emissions. It uses 1 gallon of water to produce a pound of cricket, and it uses something like 2,000 gallons to produce a pound of beef. And they eat less, they use less feed, they take up less land. So it's sort of all of the metrics are staggering, and we did a focus in comparing it to beef because one of our products is a protein powder, which is obviously competitors use whey protein. But the same holds true for chicken when you compare to chicken or pork. The pushback always is, well, we don't eat crickets as a whole, a meat. It doesn't really seem like a meat substitute. But when we started this business, part of our impetus was wanting to introduce people to the idea of eating insects with the hope that one day we could introduce a sort of patty-based product that was made out of insects instead of being made out of beef. But I think that we're just not there yet.
Sense. Let's take a couple more questions that people have submitted in the chat. So Adam is asking whether you have considered a hybrid blend recipe with something else, with some other protein.
Oh yeah, so have you had one Yeah, interesting. So on the patty side, we have not, because I think we are not yet ready to sort of switch to that type of a product. But I will say that in our chips and our protein powder, we do have a blend of protein sources. So we do use other like chia seed or flax or pea protein are sort of all in there, because mostly it's a cost thing. Crickets are expensive and we want to be able to keep the cost of our product down. And so some of those other protein sources are cheaper, which allow us to have the protein content high, but the cost of the product lower. I think over time, we really want to bump up the amount of cricket that's in there. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea on the sort of meat substitute side to take that approach too, even if it's like maybe this is what you're suggesting, but like a cricket beef blend, which obviously doesn't sort of get to the ultimate goal that we want of reducing how much meat, like traditional meat you consume, but it could be what we like the phrase that's used a lot in our industry is like a gateway bug, right? It's your way of it's your first introduction to the product, so that you are a little bit more familiar with it next time.
Makes sense. Joe, I saw that you had a question about cost. Do you want to unmute and ask?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm so excited about this. Thank you so much for being here and answering all these questions. So in the 5 to 10 year outlook horizon for alternative proteins in the US, you mentioned prohibitive costs as a reason that it's not implemented more widely. What do you think would it take for those costs to be driven down to a point where this could be more widespread?
Yeah, so it's a really tough, I hate to use this metaphor, but it's a classic chicken and egg situation where you need more investment dollars to improve the way in which we're producing and sort of farming crickets, and that's already happened. So there are companies in the country, in the US, and there's a big one in Canada and all over the world that have really, what they've worked on is developing like hardware, basically like the manufacturing facilities to be able to produce cricket powder at scale, or even just whole dry roasted crickets at scale. And they've raised a ton of venture capital dollars to be able to do that. Now, the sticky point is the demand isn't there. So until consumer behavior shifts, we're not going to be able to lower the price, because it's, if anybody's ever taken an economics class, it's like where the supply and demand curves intersect is like where you find the price. And right now, because the supply is much greater than demand, you would think that would drive price down a lot. But what's actually happening, as far as I understand, is we're not actually producing the supply that we have the capability to produce because the demand is low. And there's, in that case, there's a floor to how low you can drop the price in order to actually still have a viable business. So it really all comes back to wanting to make sure that needing the market to adjust. And I've seen it shift a lot in the 8-ish years that we've been doing this. As I said before, people truly didn't understand what we were doing when we started, and now there's a bunch of us on this call, and I don't think anybody has never heard of the idea of eating insects before, and it's very well popularized on The Economist does a lot of work around it, and National Geographic, and we've been in TV shows, and I mean, we're on Shark Tank, but even there was an episode of Insecure that featured our products. There's just a greater awareness, but there hasn't yet been this mass widespread adoption yet. And I don't think that's a problem. I sort of want to make that clear, because I know there's probably a lot of questions around that too. Is this ever going to happen? I think it will. But I think that our memories are short. And when we think about other businesses that have tried to do similar things, we forget for how long they've been trying. So I forgot exactly the years, but Impossible and Beyond Meat really only became businesses that in the popular lexicon in the past, call it 5 years. That might even be a stretch. But those businesses have been around for 10, if not more years. So there were many, many years there where they were building products, but they were also trying to wait and time with the market, and to help build market awareness and interest for these products. So we are sort of still on those early days of the adoption curve, I think, for insects for human consumption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess let's take one more question related to Chirps and then maybe talk about At1. But for this question, yeah, Bettina, you had a question about marketing. Do you want to unmute and ask?
Yeah. Hi, Meryl. Thank you. This is really fascinating. I'm Bettina. I run a marketing agency called Alder & Co, and we work with climate tech companies. And you kind of alluded to it in your last answer. I was really curious, what your marketing strategy was or is as you were building the market and convincing consumers that this is actually a thing, and then addressing the challenges, of the cost prohibition and that people weren't really used to eating insects. So how did you build your brand? And also you mentioned you worked with partners, which I thought was really clever. And like, how did you get to that idea of working with museums? And yeah, if you could elaborate on that.
It's a great question. So when we started the business, and now that I sit on sort of like the strictly climate tech side, I feel funny saying this almost, but I will explain. We started the business very much pushing the environmental angle and trying to talk to people about all the stats that I like from the link that I shared and that everybody was curious about. And it turned out no one really cared. And I think that that's just the truth of the matter. It goes back to what I said before about why people choose a product, like choose to eat something. It's price, proximity, and taste. Probably a fourth thing there would be health. And we are by nature self-centered in how we think about most of the decisions that we make. And when you're making a choice about food that's driven by the environmental impact, that is a choice you are making that affects other people first. It's external to you. And then it affects you, right? You're an agent of change. It's not going to necessarily change you. People don't do that a lot. That's why most people are not vegetarian or vegan. And obviously there are the reasons to become vegetarian and vegan, but sort of, especially for the environmental side, most people are not. I think that's changing though. But at the time, that was not something that, it was just not going to move the needle for us to acquire new customers if we continued to push the environmental angle. So a couple years into the business, we made the conscious decision to switch our messaging away from, we still included it, it's still on our products that we talk about the environmental impact, but then we sort of shifted the focus to health. And it sort of came around the time when a lot of studies had finally been concluded about the health benefits of eating insects and eating crickets. So there's, some evidence it's better for gut health, but they're very high in different vitamins like B12, vitamin C. There's a lot of iron, a lot of calcium. So we started to really focus on that. They're gluten-free, they're dairy-free, like all the buzzwords, non-GMO, which a whole other thing we could talk about whether that is necessary or not. But once we shifted the focus to like how it will be better for you, and then, oh yeah, by the way, it happens to be better for the planet, we really had a much easier time connecting with customers. Another conscious decision that we made that we have never broken, and I think we never will, is that we never show the actual cricket on our product in our marketing. So I will show a cartoon of a cricket. And that is as far as it will get, because we recognize that, especially in the US, when you see a bug, you don't immediately think, wow, that's delicious, I want to eat it. We've never hidden what's in our products. Like here, if for anyone's not familiar, I have a tub of our protein powder here. And you can see that like very clear, like eat bugs, it's like pretty obvious what's in here. But once you see it, it like changes something. So that was another marketing decision that we made. And then to your question about like the decision or how we came to partner with museums and zoos and things like that, we have an incredible member of our team named Liz, who's sort of like, she's just like superwoman, and she has a strong background in CPG sales. And I think it was her idea initially. We were thinking about where the product made sense to a consumer, where it wasn't going to be competing against all the other tortilla chips that existed. And I forget which one was our first one, but whichever was our first museum sort of started a bit of a domino effect where others started to realize that it really moved they moved off of shelves because people were both intrigued by it. You're primed a little bit differently. And then also in a gift shop at a museum, it ended up being one of the cheaper items. You know, it's not the like $20 poster, you know? So, and people are hungry because you can't often eat in museums. So then it was like a way to give people a snack afterwards. In the early days, we were also sold in Disney World, which I always thought was funny, in the animal kingdom, which I thought made a lot of sense too. But we ended up stopping distributing there. Yeah, hopefully that answers that question.
And yeah, I guess final point to that, like, where can we buy your stuff? Like, do you sell at Whole Foods or something? No.
Yeah, so we don't sell at Whole Foods. The best place to buy, honestly, is either our website or on Amazon. We've been in and out of stores because of the pandemic. Store purchasing has been different. So it's probably, and also because I don't know exactly where everybody is, that's probably the easiest place to buy our products.
Okay, so let's switch to talking about your the other venture you're involved with. Could you talk a little more about what At1 Ventures is all about?
Sure. So I might be repeating myself a little bit, but and I know perhaps some people have joined a little bit later, but we are a seed and Series A venture capital fund, $150 million fund that invests exclusively in businesses helping sort of reverse the effects of climate change. So we tend to invest in a lot of hardware. I'd say we've invested in 18 companies so far, and I believe 17 out of the 18 are hardware companies and 1 software company. But we're really looking at businesses across all different sectors, you know, energy, transportation, buildings, food and ag, manufacturing, biodiversity, ecosystem restoration, like pretty much anything that can help sort of reduce our planetary footprint and help, you know, restore the planet. The things that, you know, are helpful to know about us are checks are typically 500K to 3 million, and we invest all over the world. So about 50% of the portfolio is US based and the rest is anywhere else. And we as a team are also kind of all over the place. So at various times in the year, we're in Hawaii, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, England, and France, which is more locations than we have people. So people move around. And yeah, I'm happy to sort of talk more about anything related to that, but that's a little bit of the spiel in a little more detail.
So I guess, like, do you guys have a certain philosophy as to what types of solutions are most likely to work, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. We do. And it's interesting because it's somewhat related to my days at Chirps. So we look really at 2 things when we look at companies. So obviously we look at what we call the TIE, the total addressable impact, which is a phrase we made up. And we sort of want to understand, the example I like to give is if I'm looking at an electric boiler company, if 100% of the electric boilers in the United States, of the boilers in the United States were switched out to be electric, what would the emissions reduction be like from that switch? So sort of like a TAM calculation, a total addressable market calculation, but on the impact side. So wanting to understand, are we talking about it, is it tens of megatons? Is it hundreds? Is it, where are we on the spectrum of how much impact are we going to see? And then the other thing that we look at a lot is unit economics. So we have a firm belief as a firm that a business is only going to be successful in the climate space if it is as cheap as, if not cheaper than, the thing that it's replacing. So if you're, again, like if you're selling an electric boiler, it has to cost a homeowner the same amount of money or less money to install and own and upkeep, like maintain upkeep for that, as their gas boiler would. Otherwise, people are not going to. And the reason it reminds me of the Chirps days is it goes back to this idea, like the question you asked Bettina about marketing is, I'm not going to change, most people are not going to change something about their home that's going to cost them more just because of the environment. Most people are not able to do that. And so if we want to be able to have widespread adoption of these new technologies, they need to not cost the consumer more. So that's like a big piece of our philosophy.
So you mentioned that you guys are, for example, also in the business of ecosystem restoration. Could you maybe tell for people who don't know what are the economics of that, like who pays for ecosystem restoration in alignment with the philosophy that you just described?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it depends a lot on the different company, but oftentimes we're thinking about solutions that are where the thing that they are replacing are destroying ecosystems. So an example would be, we looked at a company earlier this year that we ended up not investing in because they were a little too late stage for us. That's in hydro. So a lot of large hydropower plants, big dams essentially, are they destroy the ecosystems that are around them, and they're very harmful to the fish that live in the water. But they also they come in and build, they look like they are disruptive, and they are disruptive. And so we were looking at a company that was doing what's called distributed hydro. So it's much smaller. You don't have to build a dam. You're sort of looking for areas where the water flows down like a certain distance over a certain time or length. And the idea would be that if there were widespread adoption of that technology instead of the disruptive technology, that would be much better for the ecosystem. So then in that case, the unit economics that we're looking at are, what does it cost to install that compared to installing traditional hydro? What are the costs? What can you sell the energy for at the other end? Things like that.
Makes sense. I think I was personally asking a little more specifically about Dendra. So it seems like they're pretty much, Dendra is one of your portfolio companies, and they
Yes.
pretty much just restore ecosystems, right? Like, are they replacing an incumbent, or like are they relying on somebody paying them to restore the ecosystems?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So Dendra, the example of Dendra is like a lot of their customers are looking to, and we can go down a rabbit hole of this as well, but Dendra is interested in, and like companies like that are interested in ecosystem restoration in the sense that a customer might have a big tract of land and they might be emitters of some kind, and they want to help, like they have a mandate either from their government or from their board to help restore some of the ecosystems nearby what they've destroyed or where they're emitting. And so that's where Dendra comes in, is they have this tool to or robots to help plant trees that can allow you to restore an ecosystem that perhaps your business has destroyed or has impacted in some way, and you want to help reduce your footprint.
So it sounds like sort of a mandatory market type of thing, where the government is requiring the customer to restore, and that's why they need somebody to do it for them.
Yeah, sometimes, or I'm seeing increasingly customers for products like, sort of in this space, it sort of touches a lot of different industries, but you'll frequently see a customer say, we're on a path to being, net zero by 2030 or 2050. And these are different ways in which they can get there, right? So maybe purchasing offsets isn't the only thing that they're considering, but I spoke to a company recently that is helping fleet owners, like trucks, cars, whatever it may be, both monitor the electric vehicles and what they're charging and where and how frequently and the costs of that, but also, and like battery health, etc. But also like they have data around where the energy is coming from at the different charging stations to help actually calculate the carbon impact from the fleet in a more precise way. And those customers don't have mandates. They are just on a path to reducing their footprint, and kind of any way they can do it, the better.
Makes sense. Let's take a question from Mai. Could you unmute yourself?
Yeah, so I was wondering if you guys had a way of thinking about some of the more abstract, some of the more like abstract cost savings involved in a lot of new climate technologies, because a lot of the long run benefits are somewhat difficult to quantify. It's like the long run cost savings, the long run like carbon costs, and like I would argue that the cost of carbon or emissions is something that like isn't really taxed but might be in the future. Like, how do you go about assessing value that a company brings to those aspects, because it tends to be a little bit less mainstream or like even difficult to like measure like objectively.
Yeah, it's a great question. When we think about costs of things, we're definitely not, if we're looking in the US, we're not really considering what this might look like if there's a carbon tax one day. So I think a lot of the things you're maybe getting at, we just tend to not bake into a unit economic calculation. So instead, it's, does this truly, if you use this thing instead of, like, if I use this electric air conditioner instead of, well, that's a silly example because a lot of them are electric, but the boiler example, if I use an electric boiler and instead of using the gas boiler, I know that I'm going to emit less. And then just from a strict, like, what does it cost to buy the thing, to install the thing, to maintain the thing over time? And what's my electric bill compared to my gas bill? Those are, it's like maybe not as fun, but those are the numbers that we're looking at and trying to calculate. And we don't, I think the hope is that when we do have things like a carbon tax, et cetera, or, you know, there's more public pressure, that'll just better help our businesses, but it's not going to be, we're not relying on anything like that. So I think it's also difficult. Solar, for example, and even wind rely a lot on tax credits. And I think that's great. And we look at that a lot when we calculate or examine businesses in that space. But I think we're probably, yeah, I'll be so bold as to say, I think we're probably fooling ourselves if we think those tax credits will exist forever. They'll probably exist for a very long time, but they keep having to be renewed because they're not, you know, guarantees, and they're meant to stimulate the market, not to be there forever.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm curious. So I see that like almost no way like actually assumes that the carbon tax will be a thing in their economic calculations, including you guys. So I wonder, like, when you project for what's going to happen in 5 to 10 years, like what do you project will happen policy wise? Like what do you factor into the economics, or do you assume that it's going to be the same thing as today?
Yeah, so we don't assume anything positively will change. I think if anything, we take a more pessimistic view and look at, for example, what stayed during the last administration. So if I look at tax credits, for example, I have looked at what Trump signed in to his infrastructure bills, et cetera, around tax benefits for renewable energy. Because if he's signing them in, then it's only going to get better from that perspective. But we're not really we're not policy makers, and we're not legislators. So we don't rely on guesses that we might make about how it might change to benefit our companies. So we really just tend to take a more pessimistic view.
That makes sense. And one more question from Joe. Go ahead, Joe.
Hey, so I'm interested in knowing how At1 Ventures thinks about not just carbon emissions or that sort of stuff, but also like other climate metrics that you might use to determine whether to fund a project. Examples might include like total greenhouse gas emissions versus just CO2, non-renewable resource usage in supply chains, et cetera.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we'll look at whatever is relevant to the company at hand. So obviously most companies are in the carbon reduction space at the moment, but we don't exclusively look at companies that are doing that because it's just one piece of the puzzle. So we'll look at methane, and that's totally fine too. Or we'll look at like, you know, number of new forest land planted, et cetera, things like that. It's hard to, like, we take a more broad approach. And then the other thing I realized I didn't mention, but is relevant to that question, is we will also look at enabling technologies. So we will look at a company that, for example, I looked really closely at an electric vehicle charging company. You can't really calculate what the emissions reduction is from that because it's not putting new electric vehicles on the road, but it's making it easier for people to make the switch to buying an electric vehicle, which that reduces like the fossil fuel vehicles on the road, et cetera. So we take a bit more, we don't have like strong mandates around these things because I think otherwise you'd probably overlook businesses that really do help move our thesis and our mission forward. but maybe don't have like the clearest metric around them. Hopefully that answered your question. Okay, cool. Got a thumbs up, so I assume it did.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Meryl. So we are 2 minutes to the end of the event, so we're gonna have to start wrapping up. Yeah, just wanna first thank you so much for this really informative session. And the second thing to the people in the audience, would like to remind that we have a time-honored tradition that after an event, people share something they learned from the event. The place where you can share that is going to be the event thread on events official channel. So please hop on there and share something that you learned. It's a great way to remember more from this talk, and a great way to, I guess, show your gratitude to the speaker. So like you actually remembered something from the talk, and also a good way to connect with other people. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is so fun. It was a great way to spend an early afternoon on a Friday.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Yeah, see you next time, everybody.
Have a good one. Bye.